Today we're going to study one of the most famous trials of all history, the trial of Niccolo Sacco and Bartolomeo Vanzetti.
But Sacco and Vanzetti lays bare a lot of the mythology about American society, right? It certainly shows the difference between what America is supposed to be about and what it has been in certain circumstances.
This is not about Vanzetti. It's not a question of whether he was guilty or innocent. It's about us.
I talk about the Sacco and Vanzetti case as often as I can. It's never very far from my mind. There's always something that happens in the daily newspapers that brings that case to mind.
These two men could not get justice in the American system. Justice is not meted out equally to the rich and the poor, to the native-born and the foreign-born.
You don't love this country, do you, Mr. Sacco?
Why you say that? I'm all over this place.
I think that the case of Sacco and Vanzetti says a lot of different things about America. It says a lot about the tension that we live with constantly between individual civil liberties and collective national security, and the tensions that inevitably accompany a society that's constantly renewing itself through waves of immigration, constantly having to deal with foreigners in its midst.
It's a story that talks about the injustices of prejudice in a society because of the social position that you occupy. The characters of Sacco and Vanzetti, the circumstances under which they suffered, as we talk about the Passion of Jesus Christ. We can also call it the Passion of Sacco and Vanzetti.
Some people think anarchists are just wild-eyed, crazy bomb throwers. But most anarchists are not bomb throwers. Most anarchists have a kind of philosophy about what society should be like. And Sacco and Vanzetti subscribe to this philosophy. They believe that the economic resources of society should be collectively owned and distributed in an equitable way so that everybody could have a job and everybody could have all the necessities of life. They were opposed to government, to the state. They felt that the state was oppressive. They felt that the state was on the side of the rich.
There's been concern about immigrants in this country from various quarters for decades before World War I, and World War I just heightens concern about immigrants.
Within literally a week of American entry into the war in April of 1917, acts of political repression aimed against radicals begins. Now will continue with increasing severity throughout the rest of the war, culminating in the Red Scare of 1919-1920. There was this widespread belief that because of the revolution in Russia, that revolution was threatening everywhere. In reality, the possibility of a social revolution in the United States was not even remote. It was absolutely non-existent. Nevertheless, the fear of the Reds is all pervasive in American society. And it's a time when you can use the Red Scare as the pretext to suppress the people you don't want at liberty. You can sweep them up, and they did by the thousands. No warrants, no trial, no nothing, just grab them, keep them locked up somewhere. They're beaten, they're intimidated, their printing presses are destroyed, their property is confiscated. The Bill of Rights and the Constitution are simply torn up during this Red Scare.
These people got no trial. These people got no hearing. They were simply picked up. 500 people were chained together and marched through the streets of Boston and then deported. This is the kind of thing that was happening.
Sacco and Vanzetti were followers of Luigi Galleani. Luigi Galleani was probably the leading Italian anarchist in this country. For the most part, in the early years, Luigi Galleani and the Galleanisti involved themselves in labor actions and in strikes. During World War I, a number of them ended up in Mexico. They left the United States to avoid the draft, but also because Galleani had advised them to leave the country and to group together. A number of them, including Sacco and Vanzetti, tried to live communally in Mexico. It was actually very difficult. But one thing that did come out of their time in Mexico was a rededication to activism and to acts of violence.
Galleani was a militant revolutionary who believed in bombs, assassinations, you name it. Everything was good if it was against the state. Now, even though it may appear contradictory, they were always able to rationalize this by the belief that the violence perpetrated by the state, the exploitation suffered by the working class, was infinitely worse than anything they could do.
There's not a great deal that's known for certain about how much, to what extent the Gallianisti were involved in bombings in this country. But it's fairly certain that the series of bombs that were attempted to be delivered through the mail in 1919 were the work of the Gallianisti. And then there was another set of bombs that were hand-delivered, and it's fairly certain that that was the work of the Gallianisti.
The question has emerged, were Sacco and Vanzetti, who were part of this Gallianisti movement, were they in any way connected to this? Now, they are not the inner core, as were some of their comrades. But if nothing else, they knew what was going on.
They were in places where Gallianisti were talking about committing these acts of violence, but there was nothing that ever actually traced them to these individual acts of violence.
These are not indiscriminate bombings. Nobody is chucking a bomb into a cafe or a theater. If you look at the people to whom bombs were sent through the mail, every individual was somebody involved in the persecution of anarchists and workers.
And a bomb was exploded at the house of the Attorney General Palmer, what we would call today a terrorist act. And the problem with terrorist acts is not only that they're terrible in themselves, but the reaction to terrorist acts is usually that the government does not know who the terrorists are, but they will simply go into a panic and begin arresting everybody in sight who might possibly conceivably be a terrorist.
In the effort to apprehend the perpetrator of these bombings, various clues emerged, particularly a leaflet that was left at the scene of Palmer's house and other bombing sites, which was called Plain Words.
The powers that be make no secret of their will to stop, here in America, the worldwide spread of revolution. The powers that be must reckon that they will have to accept the fight they have provoked. There will have to be bloodshed. There will have to be murder. We will destroy to rid the world of your tyrannical institutions. Long live a social revolution. Down with tyranny. The anarchist fighters.
And the suspicion was immediately that the Gallianisti are responsible. And at that point, they tracked down this leaflet to this print shop in Brooklyn, where Salcedo and Elia work, and they are apprehended. Now, they are not formally under arrest. They are simply held almost incommunicado.
Salcedo is kept in FBI offices on the 14th floor of the Park Row building, was not allowed to call out to anybody, family, friends, lawyer, was questioned, and according to a fellow prisoner, was beaten. And then during the 8th week of his imprisonment, May 3rd, 1920, the body of Salcedo was smashed to a pulp, was found on the pavement near the Park Row building. The FBI announced that he had committed suicide by jumping from the 14th floor window of the room in which they'd kept him.
The Gallianisti are in a panic. What do we do? Vanzetti was dispatched from Boston, because he was the only one who didn't have a steady job, to talk to Carlo Tresca. Carlo Tresca was the anarchist in New York who was not part of the Galliani movement, but was the anarchist and the man with all kinds of connections with lawyers and politicians, American Civil Liberties Union. He was the man who you went to in time of trouble. His advice to Vanzetti was, go back, tell the comrades, stay low, and above all, try to hide any incriminating evidence, particularly literature.
Si comincia di notte a avvisare gli amici, i compagni, i lavoratori, che la repressione dura è in corso. Ed è durante una notte di paura che Sacco e Vanzetti finiscono nelle mani della polizia.
In July of this year, 2 bandits, Sacco and Vanzetti, were convicted of murder in the first degree by a jury of the Norfolk County Court. Their trial was entirely fair. The presiding judge specially cautioned the jury not to allow the fact that the defendants are Italians to influence you or prejudice you in the least degree. In short, every right was granted to the defendants. But Sacco and Vanzetti belong to a sacred class. They are communists. All over Europe, apparently, the various congeners of the Bolsheviki are going to howl against a fictitious injustice. At least their sentimental sympathizers in this country might be awakened into common sense. Or do they really wish that a person clothed with the sublime character of a communist, an anarchist, or even a socialist shall be exempt from the jurisdiction of the criminal courts? The New York Times.
The American judicial system is much better than the judicial system of a totalitarian state. But it is far from a fair system. And the fact that you go through procedures and appeals and processes doesn't guarantee that in the end, there will be fairness.
Once the verdict is read, there are immediately a number of areas for appeal. The first appeal is filed several months after the verdict, and it deals with a jury form in Ripley. There's a friend of his named Daly who deposes that he mentioned to Ripley that he thought those guineas might actually be innocent, to which Ripley replied, according to Daly, "Damn them, they ought to hang them anyway." So that's the basis of the first appeal. And then the next 3 or 4 appeals dealt with changing testimony. Louis Pelzer changed his testimony. Carlos Goodrich changed his testimony. Judge Thayer took almost a year deliberating the first set of appeals, and then rejected them all in one day, in October 1924.
Judge Thayer presided over the trial. It was Judge Thayer who also ruled on each of the supplementary motions for a new trial. So were Thayer to rule in favor of Sacco and Vanzetti, he would basically have to admit to having done something wrong the first time around.
And at one point he goes to a football game in Dartmouth. He's a Dartmouth alum, and he runs into a political science professor there named James Richardson. And he begins, as he so often did, going on at length about the trial, and eventually says, "Did you see what I did to those anarchist bastards the other day? That should hold them for a while." He had just turned down something like 5 or 6 motions in a single day.
They had to have another angle, to keep these men alive, because once Judge Thayer sentenced them, no more appeals.
Probably the most tantalizing, the most traumatizing, the most disturbing appeal was the Medeiros appeal. There was a small-time Portuguese criminal, Celestino Medeiros, who was in a cell next to Sacco's. And at some point late in 1925, he tried to slip Sacco a note, and Sacco ignored him. He thought he was a spy. And finally, Medeiros got the note to him, and the note said, "I was involved in the South Braintree crime, and Sacco and Vanzetti weren't." And Sacco burst into tears. This was, a final hope for him, really.
Celestino Medeiros, yes. Celestino Medeiros was a member of this Morelli gang. They came out of Providence, Rhode Island. And the feeling is very strong that these were the real culprits, because they knew a lot about the goings on of deliveries of shipments of shoes, and they were out. These are out and out killers. These were bandits, outlaws. And it's remarkable that one of the Morelli people, if you see a photograph of Morelli, looks very much like Nicola Sacco.
Medeiros' evidence, in my opinion, was quite compelling on several points. He described quite accurately the movements of the men on the morning of the crime. He mentioned that 2 cars were used in the robbery, something that had been kept a secret at the trial. And he apparently correctly identified where the 2 cars had been switched, in Randolph, the next town over from Braintree. But Thayer said he gave no weight to the Medeiros confession, and the Supreme Judicial Court eventually threw out the motion as well.
And then Judge Thayer renders the death sentence on April 9th, 1927.
Interestingly, we always associate Sacco and Vanzetti. They rarely saw each other during those 7 years. They were comrades, and it wasn't as if they were the best of friends before. They were separated. They weren't even in adjacent prison cells. So they were alone.
For Sacco, it was unbearable because this was a family man. He missed his wife, he missed his kids.
Sacco was a person who liked to work with his hands. Obviously, he was a very skilled shoe worker. And he also was a gardener, and it must have been terrible for him to be locked in a dark prison cell for 7 years. Sacco, for a while, is in a hospital for the criminally insane. He goes on a hunger strike. Vanzetti, too, breaks down. I think the reason that they wrote so many letters was probably just you need some sort of outlet to survive. I think as it becomes clear that the appeals are denied, as it becomes clear that the Massachusetts Supreme Court is not going to overturn the verdict, as the death sentence is passed, then people really start realizing that Sacco and Vanzetti are going to die. This is going to happen. And that energizes people. And let's face it, there's a bandwagon effect. And the communists in particular see the propaganda value of the case. They recognize Sacco and Vanzetti as potential martyrs for the working class.
Really, the left is defined increasingly as communist in the 1920s. And so the Communist Party in this country, and especially internationally, had an enormous role in publicizing the Sacco and Vanzetti case. And in a way, their involvement was a double-edged sword. They could treat the case very cynically at times.
Now, one member of the Communist Party, when asked, don't they think that the loss of a life like Sacco and Vanzetti is a terrible shock? And the answer was reported in the media. He said that as far as I'm concerned, they're better off dead. Of what use are they to us alive? That was reported in the media. And it's a callous type of a remark.
Boston Brahmins were a notoriously conservative and stodgy bunch, but there were also a number of very liberal Boston Brahmins, and certain of them took up the cause of Sacco and Vanzetti immediately and in really sort of substantial ways. Elizabeth Glendower Evans was a very wealthy and liberal Bostonian woman, and she became convinced early on that Sacco and Vanzetti were innocent, and she wrote regularly to Sacco and Vanzetti. She would send them flowers and fruit and food, and she contributed enormously economically to their defense.
There were 7 years of intense national attention, international attention, and all sorts of demonstrations taking place in this country and abroad, and the court appeals going on and on. And finally, Governor Fuller decides to quell the protests, or to try to do it, by setting up, a blue ribbon commission. 3 people whose integrity could not possibly be challenged. President of Harvard, president of MIT, and a retired judge. You might say 3 typical Americans. Peers of Sacco and Vanzetti, of course.
The head of this 3-man committee is A. Lawrence Lowell, the president of Harvard University, whose family fortune was gained by the exploitation of textile workers in Lawrence and Lowell, Massachusetts.
Governor Fuller sets up the Lowell Committee, and it's clear immediately that what their role is to uphold the verdicts. A. Lawrence Lowell actually drafts the committee's response, drafts its report before the defense makes its final arguments.
The committee decides that Sacco and Vanzetti have been granted a fair trial, and people are devastated. And the execution is scheduled for August 10th, and then at the 11th hour, there's a temporary stay, and the new date is scheduled for August 23rd.
There are demonstrations daily, and it's not just in Boston.
Sacco e Vanzetti furono arrestati a Boston una sera con sorpresa.
There are demonstrations really throughout the country and throughout the world. There are demonstrations, occasionally violent demonstrations, in really every major city in Europe, in Japan, in China, in northern and southern Africa. There's really no place in the world that's untouched by this trial by the summer of 1927.
Letters are pouring into the governor's office. Protests are mounting. People begin to feel the sense that it could possibly be over, and not in a way that anybody had hoped. And Sacco's wife, Rosina, goes to the office of the governor of Massachusetts, Alvin Fuller, and reportedly gets on her knees and begs the governor to spare her husband's life with tears in her eyes, and she's denied.
Well, what a heartache, what a heartbreaking experience that must have been to so many people. You can't help but identify with those who were experiencing this long, drawn-out 7-year ordeal, leading to the end of all hopes for them to save these two innocent men.
On the night of August 22nd, there are 3 men who were sentenced to die: Celestino Medeiros, Sacco, and Vanzetti. Celestino Medeiros had been convicted of another crime. He had eaten himself into a stupor. He had tossed and turned in bed until it was time for him to go. Sacco and Vanzetti were quite composed. They sat writing last letters to loved ones, meeting with visitors.
And at the very end, very end, before the execution, Sacco wrote a letter to his son, which was so moving, It was a letter that was full of hope and optimism and absolutely extraordinary, just before he's going to his death.
Son, instead of crying, be strong, so as to be able to comfort your mother. And when you want to distract your mother from the discouraging soulness, I will tell you what I used to do. To take her for a long walk into the quiet country, gathering wildflowers here and there, resting under the shade of the gentle tranquility of Mother Nature. But remember always, Dante, in the play of happiness, don't you use all for yourself only, but help the weak ones that cry for help. Help the persecuted and the victim, because they are your better friends.
And he says, always remember that we are not criminals, and one day you will be proud of us. And Dante, I kiss you and I clasp you in a firm embrace. Then he taps on the cell door and he asks the guard, take this to my son.
In Boston, martial law is declared, and the streets are absolutely silent. In New York, there's a vigil in Union Square. And at just after midnight, the executions take place.
There were actually 3 executions that night. The first one was Medeiros. He went very quietly. Sacco also went pretty quietly.
He says goodbye to his family. He shouts, "Long live anarchy." And then just as the electricity is applied, he says, "Farewell, mother." And then Vanzetti is the last to go. He walks into the death chamber. He shakes the warden's hand and thanks him for all that he's done for him. This is an act of composure that is apparently very moving to people who are witnessing the execution.
Vanzetti made a statement in which he declared that he was innocent of all crimes, that he had done some sins, but no crime. And in his last words, as the hood was being put over him before he was electrocuted, he is reported to have said, "I now want to forgive some of these people for what they are doing to me."
In 1927, it was a hot summer night in 1927. It was hot in Boston. It was hotter in New York, I think. We were trying to watch the electricity because we were told that the force of the electricity going through the electric chair would in some way diminish the power of the lights. And so I think we were looking for that. I think the feeling was, I wouldn't want to say relief, but the tension is over now. It's settled now. They're gone. Question of their living is over now. The rest of the question is, did they deserve that fate? That's something else again.
I think it's important to remember this case because of what it suggests about the United States. We pride ourselves on being a nation of immigrants, on the American dream, being available to everyone who comes here and wants to pursue it. And there are moments where we don't live up to that ideal. There are moments where we fail. And And I think if we forget our failures, then we're in serious trouble.
I think one of the reasons that the case has lasting meaning is because it speaks to issues that remain alive today.
The Department of Justice is waging a deliberate campaign of arrest and detention to protect American lives.
Critics still say the Department of Justice is casting too wide a net, trampling on civil liberties to ensure safety.
Unfortunately, in the American justice system, who you are and what you believe has enormous importance, especially during periods of perceived crisis or real crisis. This is a nation that's often poised to overreact. It's tragic, but it's true. Who you are matters in this country in terms of what sort of justice you'll receive.
Well, it sort of gets into the guts of American society. It exposes realities that many people would like to forget. This is a case which is about political intolerance. This is a question about racial prejudice. It demonstrates aspects of American society that then and now still persist. If you espouse the wrong political views, if you're not a conformist, the chances of you getting a fair trial are substantially diminished. And if Italians are no longer looked upon with the disdain and contempt they were in 1920, they've been replaced by other ethnic groups.
You know, the case resonates with me so deeply because it is so inspiring to see these two men and how they bear themselves in a situation where they have been so cruelly dealt with, how they maintain their dignity and how they maintain their ideas. And it brings to light so much about America, about patriotism, about what it really is and what it shouldn't be, and the need for a new society in which the existence of men like Sacco and Vanzetti and their dream of a truly democratic, egalitarian society remains alive.
Oh, pour me a drink of Italian red wine and let me taste it and call back to mind. Once more in my thoughts, once more in my soul, a story as great, if not greater than all. It was 1920, the 5th of May. The cop and some buddies took these men away. Off of the car and out and down to the jail in Brockton town. There's been a killing and a robbery at the Slater Memorial Shoe Factory. And you two gents are carrying guns, and you dodged the draft when the war did come. Oh yes, it's so, it's so, it's so. We made for the borders of Mexico. The rich man's war we could not fight, so we crossed the border to keep out of sight. Now let me think and let me see